Well, let's get more on the story. We're joined by Professor Alex van der Hever, who's with the Wits School of Governance. Prof, I was just saying to Stephen that, cautiously optimistic, like the idea of not having to wear a mask, but it's almost become so part of our lives now.
Yes, I think it will be a big change. I think that this is probably could have been done a while ago, because I don't think that the waves of infection really are that important now to the risk of severe illness and death. And so it is relatively safe to now interact if you've been vaccinated and previously infected. So that's really the reason that this can now be done. It's not that really we've got a handle on the epidemic. It's just that the virus has created sufficient immunity together with vaccinations that now it's much less of an issue.
Of course, in many ways, having a face mask, sanitizing every time you're coming in and out of a building, it makes you as an individual feel like you're in power and that you have some level of control over whether or not you contract COVID-19. Whether scientifically that is in fact the case is a whole other argument. Taking some of these protocols away is likely to create, again, that level of anxiety about, are we really out of the woods? We said we'll live with the virus. Is this what that means?
Yeah, so firstly, I think the virus is endemic. It's not going to go away. So it's with us for the rest of our lives, and we will be infected with it through the rest of our lives. It also doesn't mean that people who are vulnerable in particular ways and have severe comorbidities, that they still won't be affected, even if they've been vaccinated or previously infected. So if somebody is vulnerable, they probably need to protect themselves in high-risk settings of transmission. Hand washing and sanitizing probably didn't have much of an impact in the first place, and was probably contributed more to people, exactly as you say, feeling that they were doing something at least to protect themselves. Masks, if they were just the surgical masks or cloth masks, also probably weren't that good at protection. But N95s probably were, and close-fitting masks. And if somebody is vulnerable or went through this epidemic without being infected and has not been vaccinated, they actually remain quite vulnerable. So people will have to, from this point on, protect themselves if they feel concerned. So I think that the removal of these mandates effectively doesn't mean that you should just stop wearing a mask if you feel in any way uncertain about your risk status.
It's one thing, again, for experts like yourself to have a view. It's another, of course, what the Department of Health does. We've seen them kind of go in different directions when deciding what should stay as regulation and what shouldn't. What would you want to see this time round?
Well, I think that the restrictions can pretty much be removed. I mean, the consensus is that they don't really, even at the most severe parts of the pandemic, some of the non-pharmaceutical interventions were not that effective. A lot of people weren't adhering to them in many high-risk settings anyway. And the levels of transmission that we had, certainly from the second and third waves, were so high that we actually had a vaccination effect. So I think that the issue is, the consensus is now they were immaterial even in some parts of the pandemic when we weren't properly protected, and at this point in time they have no value. There's no value for money for maintaining them. So I think really that is the consensus. They really don't make a difference.
What do you think is going to be the likely effect then in the scenario where these regulations are done away with on the conversation around vaccinations? For whatever reason, it doesn't seem that government is really making as much headway as it would have hoped to.
Yeah, so you have to look at vaccinations in conjunction with levels of infection. And the levels of infection have been very, very high in South Africa. Virtually everybody, around about 90% of the population at least, has been infected, even if they weren't vaccinated. So, and many people have been infected multiple times. So for many people who weren't vaccinated, they've actually been naturally vaccinated. The only problem with with infections being the method or the route to a degree of immunity from severe illness has been that many people died. So at this point in time, the people who survived that period and still haven't got vaccinated, but were infected, probably are protected against severe illness if they develop a comorbidity, which will increase their vulnerability going forward.
How do you think that this should then affect the government spending on vaccines going forward?
Well, I think that they can continue to make vaccines available, and they should, particularly targeted high-risk groups, because those are going to be the people who need it on an ongoing basis, potentially. So potentially people who get booster shots every year. And some people will develop comorbidities. They haven't got them now, but they will become more vulnerable as they age, for instance. And those people will need to probably get enhanced protection from additional vaccinations. It might be that there are improved vaccines over time, and there has been a very big investment in COVID on treatment as well, and a lot of these might materialize more effectively in the next few years too. So there is an issue about combining vaccination with effective treatment for people who are vulnerable to the development of severe illness, the people who get hospitalized.
Professor Alex van der Hever, thanks for your time. He's with the Wits School of Governance.